Just
So, she won't be out soon. Okay. Well, should we?
Wait another minute while everyone's on. Thank you, everyone. We're going to wait about 1 more minute while everyone gets on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure people will be hopping on along the way. I'm Trisha Kalala. I'm the Product Partnerships Director on the Learner Variability Project with Digital Promise. And if everyone else from Digital Promise, could you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Jessica Jackson, and I'm the Practitioner Partnership Director for the Learner Variability Project.
Hi, I'm Meta Dade. I'm the Director of Research for the Learner Variability Project.
And I am Barbara Pape. I'm Policy and Communications Director for the Learner Variability Project. And I would like to introduce Amy Nicholson, who is the Vice President Partner Impact for one of our favorite partners, Turnaround for Children. We've done a lot with them throughout the couple of years I've been here, including with Dr. Pamela Cantor, both a webinar, and we have a video from her, and we share each other's resources. They're a great organization. And Amy is going to talk to us a little bit today about their work at Turnaround and how it relates to what we're doing. So Amy, you're up now.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And it is a pleasure to be here this morning or afternoon, depending on where in the country you are, with you guys today. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk to you about the work that we're doing at Turnaround, and then hopefully have some time to think about how we can apply this work to your individual contexts and what this can look like in your practice. So a little bit of background. At Turnaround, we are focused on answering the question of what it would look like to have an education system that is transformed to support the whole child, designed for equity, and supported in a way that every child gets what he or she needs to thrive. So today we're going to be talking about that whole child vision for education and do a little bit of digging into what it would look like to actually take the science of learning and development to help every child thrive. So because I am a former educator and came out of the classroom, I always have to have objectives for any session that we do. So today our objectives are the following: that we are going to spend some time understanding how biology and context work together to drive individual learning and development. And then, like I said before, I want to make sure that we create a little bit of space to think about the power that each of you carries as educators, as district leaders, as folks that are involved in the education landscape to make this work come to light and think about how we can help every child thrive. So before we get started, I'm going to ask you guys to play along with me in a new technology endeavor on my part and use a Mentimeter polling. So if everybody could pull out your cell phone or go to your desktop, whatever, and go to menti.com and type in the code, we will see if this poll works. And then we'll have a good sense of just who's on the call, and it'll help me with the rest of the session.
584604.
All right.
I totally do.
Appropriate. Like I would,
Yeah.
I can think of.
Great. All right. Well, it looks like most people have responded. We have a lot of others, so I'm wondering if those are folks from Digital Promise and folks that work for nonprofits, and then some district leaders, school leaders, and policymakers. So a good cross section, and hopefully you will be able to find something to apply to the seat that you are in, and we'll talk together about how we can translate the science into your role. So a little bit about a background about Turnaround for Children. So our journey to understanding the system, structures, and practices that need to be in place for this type of whole child design we're talking about began in 2002 when Dr. Pamela Cantor, who you see on the displayed slide, was commissioned by Columbia University to do a large-scale research study on the effects of 9/11 on the school children of New York. So what she discovered as she talked to more and more children, especially children from neighborhoods that weren't in the surrounding areas to ground zero, was that a lot of the kids who were coming from neighborhoods that had high poverty, high crime rates, that they were more affected by the adverse experiences happening all around them in an ongoing fashion than those who were actually closest to where the Twin Towers were on that day. Because for many of those students, it was their first experience of something traumatic or adverse in their life, and they had a lot of buffers in place. But for so many other students, they were encountering this kind of adversity in an ongoing way. So they weren't suffering from PTSD as a result of the experience. There was no post in their experience. It was that all of the time they were experiencing this level of stress, and it was chronic. So Pam decided to take what she had learned, what she knew about the brain, trauma, adversity, and found Turnaround for Children. And so at Turnaround for Children, we think very intentionally about how we bring that knowledge and support to schools so that we can design them to be better prepared to meet students, like the student you see on this slide, who's walking into actually one of our DC schools, carrying her backpack. And in that backpack, it's representative of all of these wonderful experiences and assets she's bringing into the school building, but also a lot of the negative experiences that she might have encountered in her young life already, and even some of them might be traumatic. And what we do at Turnaround is we help educators think about what meets this little girl on the other side of the door. How have we designed our learning environments so that they are supportive regardless of what is in the backpack that this young lady is carrying into the building with her. So our vision at Turnaround is that one day all children will attend schools that prepare them for the lives that they choose. We know that children are born with unlimited potential, but there are certain things and obstacles that can get in the way of every child reaching that potential. So we believe if we connect the dots between adversity, stress, and academic performance and create the supportive environments our schools can be, that they can be a really important lever in preparing children for the lives that they choose. And this belief drives our work, it informs our purpose, and it's core and central to everything we do at Turnaround. You can see our mission statement on the slide. I won't read it to you, but it talks about how we translate this vision into practice. Okay. So our educational system, as it is currently conceptualized, was built and designed on premises that we now actually know to be false. We once believed that genes were the drivers of who we became, including our intelligence. We now know that the brain is malleable. Genes are chemical followers, and context is the driver of who children become. We also used to believe that talent was scarce. We believed that it was distributed in a bell curve where most fell in the middle and only a few had talent that fit on either end of the tail. We now know that talent is plentiful, and there are many potential pathways through which we can develop this talent. Third, we believe that an average score, an average height, an average speed stood in for the individual. But today we know that average rarely represents an individual, and that children's development is actually really jagged and nonlinear. We also used to believe that the factory model is the way to educate children. And this resulted in lots of memorization. It was a good and efficient way to educate children. And now we know that agency and skill development matter, and we need to be focused much more on engagement, especially building higher order skills. And finally, we believed that the potential of one student was knowable in advance, but we actually now know that potential becomes visible when environments are designed to reveal it. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these things, but I wanted to start just with a framing of some of the false narratives that actually informed how we designed our current educational system, so that we can have that information as we think about what transformation is necessary. All of these things we believed to be true actually turned out to be false. But knowing that these were the ways that our education system was designed makes it easier to understand how we created the school system the way that we did. So it was designed to deliver content to kids, to test them, to sort kids into groups, who could go to college, who was designed for good jobs, and who was not. And that's exactly the way our education system is still operating today in most places. And when we understand the false premises that were used to design the current educational system, it's easy to see why it's been unfair and even harmful to so many children. It's unfair because it reinforces racial, ethnic, and gender stereotypes. It's unfair because it communicates that some lives are more deserving of opportunities than others. It's unfair because it oppresses and marginalizes children. It's unfair because it fails to address the adversity and the effects that has on the learning and developing brain, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And it's because we aren't leveraging the science we know to design our educational system that we've really ended up replicating a lot of these inequities. So it turned around, one of the ways that these science findings have led us to pursue some deeper work is through a group of researchers, scientists, and practitioners called the SOLD Alliance. So a group of us from Turn Around for Children, Pam, our founder and senior science advisor, came together with leaders from the organizations that you see on this slide, and they started to think about what science should we pay attention to in order to design an education system that is actually focused on equity. And to make this material easier to use, we distilled it into 9 science principles that I'll show you in just a second, and also put forth several research papers that you can access. They're available on our website. I also think they might be posted. If you guys have a learning platform, we can make sure that they're accessible for you guys there. And then they're also available on the SOLD Alliance website too. And these papers really look at how children develop, what is the science we should pay attention to. And then the newest paper that came out just in 2019 is really about the implications for practice. So what does it mean to understand this science? How would you actually design a classroom, a school, a district system to be able to support learners in this way. So these on your screen now, you see the 9 current principles. It's an ongoing effort where we're always researching and learning more. So you see a box for future findings. And we believe that these principles, some of which I covered when we were talking about the falsehoods versus what we now know, these things have profound implications for systems transformation that can really lead to equity for all learners. So we plan to continue to announce new findings as the research progresses, but this is a really good starting point. And I want to specifically draw your attention to the anchors, relationships and context, which is where we're gonna spend the bulk of our time talking today. Are there any questions before I keep moving through how Turnaround thinks about translating this? Okay, just jump in or add a question to the chat if something comes up, and I'll try and make space along the way for folks to interject or make meaning as we go along. So this slide looks at what we call our vision for school and student success. And this is a manifestation of the science and how Turnaround thinks about translating it into school level practice. So we start by thinking about a whole child purpose, and then we focus on the system structures and educator practices to build developmental relationships to ensure that we've created a safe and supportive school environment. And then think about the integrated skill and mindset development that can intentionally be built in the systems and structures that can support that to ensure that we are personalizing learning for each child and each student and aren't falling into sort of that trap of averages that we talked about. And all of this is in service of what has become somewhat of a mantra for us at Turnaround for Children, that if we really embrace the science, we can, instead of asking children to beat the odds, we can use the science to change the odds for students and create a more equitable education system. So when I think about my purpose for doing this work and why I work for Turnaround, why I got into education, this slide is deeply resonant for me. So I want to do another quick group poll and have each of you ground in what brought you to this work. What is your purpose for engaging in education, and even more specifically in thinking about trauma-informed practice and the importance of social emotional learning and skill development. So you can go to your Mentimeter again and go ahead and put in 3 words that describe your purpose for doing this work. Give just 20 more seconds for folks to think about if they want to enter a word in to fill out our cloud. Wonderful. And as you are finishing up thinking about what 3 words resonated most with you, I want you to think about where that purpose came from. So can you trace your why to particular relationships or experiences in your life? And I'm not going to ask you to enter those into a chat speech or a Mentimeter, but just think about, so words like transformation, equity, developing learners, whole child, continuous learning, so many of the things that you guys put as motivators for you. Reflect on where those came from. As we move into the next section, we're really going to be talking about how context and biology work together to drive development. So it's really your DNA along with your environment, your relationships, and your experiences, which are the three things that I mean when I say context, really impact the way your brain grows and develops. And that brings us to actually one of our very core principles that came out of the science of learning and development, and that it is different than the way we believed brains developed 30-some years ago. So the first thing to remember is that the brain is malleable. It is shaped by the interactions between our genes and our context. Up until the 60s, researchers thought that your brain developed until you were 5 years old, and then it was done. Your brain had changed in all of the ways that it could, but it's only been since technology has allowed us to look more closely at the human brain that we've really come to understand the incredible malleability of the brain. And so here's what we know now. There are 20,000 genes in the human genome, and fewer than 10% of them get expressed. So that leads me, as I was preparing for this, to think about, okay, so what determines which of these genes gets expressed? And what we know from the science is that a brain is built in response to experience, and it's built across the lifetime as well. So you can see on this slide that our experiences lead to new neural connections. So neurons are created, they are strengthened, they are pruned and reorganized as a result of the experiences that we have in our life. And it's also important to remember that no part of the brain develops in isolation. So if you think back to that early slide that we looked like with the little girl walking into a school building, that backpack that she's carrying is also a metaphor for her brain. So we can no more separate her experiences and those assets and positive and negative experiences she's bringing into the building, then we can separate the brain that is learning math skills from the one that is engaged in social emotional learning or has encountered that trauma or that adversity. No part of the brain operates in isolation. And then we look at the brain development across the lifetime. So if you see, these are slide images of a brain at birth, at 6 years, and at 14 years. And when I look at this slide makes a lot of sense to me, because what we know about babies is they come out and they are pretty helpless. There's very little that they can do. But then by the time they're 6 years old, I mean, look at this slide of the brain. While there are the same number of neurons in each of these three slides, you can see that the connection between them is dramatically different depending on what phase of life you're in. So to me, this slide of the 6-year-old brain reminds me of a lot of 6-year-olds I know. So what do we know about 6-year-olds? They are interested in everything. Their favorite color is purple. They love blue. They like soccer and basketball and baseball, and everybody is their best friend, and they're sort of connecting, wired for curiosity. And then by the time you're 14, this feels a little bit more resonant. I taught middle school, so they were a little bit younger than 14, but just on the cusp, where in adolescence, there's a lot of pruning that goes on. So what we know about adolescents is they have opinions. They know what they like. So rather than liking soccer and baseball and hockey, they have now focused and are really just into basketball. Or instead of feeling like they want to explore all different subject matters, they've honed in on some of their preferences. And that has to do with the experiences and the environment and the relationships that have supported the development of some and strengthened the development of some of these pathways and caused others to be pruned and fall away. So what we know about this is that the malleability of the brain creates both an incredible opportunity and also vulnerability. And that is dependent on the context. So we're going to talk a little bit about negative context, and then I promise you that we will get to a hopeful and optimistic story that comes out of the science as well. So we know there are 3 different kinds of stress that are important for us to talk about today. Not all stress is bad. Actually, a lot of stress is really good. So positive stress prepares us. It alerts us. It helps us focus our attention and be ready for a test or an activity or something that is in front of us. And tolerable stress is the result of a serious temporary stress response. The difference between tolerable and toxic stress is a buffer. So tolerable stress is tolerable because of the supportive relationships that we have and that make it manageable. So any time stress becomes toxic, it's when it overwhelms our ability to cope with the level of stress. So this can look different for different people depending on their context, but it's important to think about stress as a good body response that we have that prepares us and alerts us. But if it becomes chronic and it's left unbuffered, it can actually have some very serious developmental effects on the brain. So that leads us to talk about the ACEs study. I imagine many of you have heard of the ACEs study and are familiar with these adverse childhood experiences. They're listed on your slide, and the first 10 bullet points were actually included in the original ACEs study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente about 20 years ago. They began a longitudinal study and asked thousands of adults about their experience with these original 10 ACEs. And then the research now has also started to look at some of these instances or experiences that are in the far right column around racism, witnessing violence, lack of neighborhood safety, bullying, foster care. I've even seen on this list overly punitive school discipline systems. So there's a lot of ways to think about how these adverse childhood experiences can affect us. But it's also really important, especially as folks thinking back to who's on this webinar and who's in this room. Many of us are working with adults in the system, and it's important to remember that we do not get a reset button on our ACEs when we turn 18. Many of the adults in our system, many of us as educators ourselves, have experienced these things as well, and they shape the way you respond to school and the way you continue to respond to your environment. So it's important to kind of hold that as a truth that's true about child development, that it also, what's true about child development is true about human development as well. And what the research found when they looked at this study was that there were some very serious implications for children who had experienced 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. Actually, 9 out of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States were correlated with exposure to 4 or more ACEs. The one that I always hone in on as an educator is this 32 times more likely to have learning and behavior problems. And that's not 32% more likely. That is 32 times more likely to be experiencing these things in the classroom. And so we think about what this stress response might look like and how so many of these children are being misdiagnosed as having attention deficit disorder when really they're locked in a hypervigilant state. And they are many of the students who are acting out, and teachers are consistently having more negative interactions with. So we think about how our systems are designed to reinforce or support students that might be struggling because of prior experiences that we've had. Also on this slide are the more physical and body connections that stress causes. And the last point here about the ACEs study is that individuals that have 6 or more ACEs, on average, their lifespan is shortened by nearly 20 years. So this leads us to ask the question, what is going on inside our brains and bodies as a result of ACEs and exposure to toxic stress? And to answer those questions, we really need to understand a little bit more about the brain's structure and function. So we're going to start by looking at the limbic system. So the limbic system is made up of 3 key components, and you see them on this slide. So the prefrontal cortex is right in the front of your brain. It is your air traffic control system. So it is regulating your thoughts, your emotions, and your behavior. It is responsible for your executive functioning, and a lot of your higher order thinking skills require engaging your prefrontal cortex. Your hippocampus is the part of your brain that stores memory and all of your new learning so you can access it again. So pretty important for education and learning. And finally, the amygdala, this third section of the brain that's highlighted as part of the limbic system on this slide, is your brain's smoke detector. So the amygdala lets you know when you are in danger and sends out alert signals that releases cortisol and floods your brain and body to prepare you for a fight, flight, or freeze response. And these parts of the brain do not work in isolation. They are structurally and functionally integrated. And it means they're physically connected to each other. They communicate, they interact, and impact each other because they're part of the same network in the brain. And when these structures of the brain work together effectively and efficiently, that is how learning happens. It helps you accomplish your goal. For a student engaging in learning, you need to be able to successfully engage each of these parts of your brain. But then we think about what happens when the brain is exposed to chronic unbuffered stress. And that leads us to talk about the stress hormone cortisol. So I can't see many of your faces or hands, but I would usually ask how many of you have heard of cortisol and know the impact that it can have on brains and bodies. Probably several of you, I see a couple thumbs up, have heard of this stress hormone. And when the stress hormone floods your brain and your body, it has an impact on your behavior as well. But the chronic exposure to the stress hormone cortisol can cause structural changes to each of these 3 parts of the brain. And it also causes us to be on high alert and hypervigilant. So the brain, the stress response system, our amygdalas are very good at alerting us of danger. They are very good at protecting us and locking us in for survival. The amygdala is very bad, though, at knowing the difference between real danger and perceived danger. So I think back to my time as a classroom teacher, and I worked with certain students who would have very seemingly outsized responses to something that seemed pretty normal in a classroom. They might get bumped, they might have someone take a pencil from them or snatch a piece of paper that they were not passing quickly enough along to the end of the row. And they would have incredibly outsized reactions to this type of what seemed innocuous. But what was happening was because of their exposure to chronic trauma and adversity, their brains were locked in a hypervigilant state and they didn't know the difference between being in a safe environment like a classroom and being in a perhaps very unsafe environment that they might have been exposed to or currently living in their home situation or a neighborhood situation. So there were, I'm sure all of us can think of individuals that we've worked with in the past where it seems like they're having an irrational response when really your brain has just been programmed and wired to have a specific response because of the influx and consistent flooding of cortisol on your brain and body. So I want us to take a minute and think about, have any of you seen examples? And these examples can be in a classroom, or they can even be examples of your own experience. My colleague always talks about the experience of losing her daughter in the gap, and how it was just an amygdala trigger and sort of went into incredibly high alert because she was looking around and her 3-year-old had seemingly disappeared. So we know we can all relate to sort of that experience of having sweaty palms, our hearts racing, kind of that flood of cortisol. But in your own work, can you think of examples of where you have seen a triggered amygdala, either in a student or an adult, or in your own experience? I'll pause just for a minute to let people think about that and type in their response.
None.
Yep. Yeah, so as you can see from the examples, and if you have others, you can keep sending them in. But some of these, it's good to have a triggered amygdala in a stress response. It prepares you if there is danger or someone actually is choking or needs something. But I'm wondering, for an example of like where you heard a loud noise and then the student's reaction was outsized. You can imagine why that might be when we start to think about children as and their reactions, is what has happened to them, what is in their context that might have led to this reaction versus what is wrong with the way this child is responding. So it helps us having an understanding of the brain chemistry and what's going on inside our brains and bodies, understand, and we're more of an empathy lens for both adults that are getting triggered by different things and for our students whose context and experiences might lead them to have some of these outsized reactions. So thank you guys all for sharing those. And all of this is just to say that adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside children. It happens inside all of us through the biological mechanism of stress. But I promised you the science was optimistic. And we have already talked about how the brain's malleability is both a vulnerability, which we have seen in some of the results from being exposed to chronic stress and some of the reactions that we've observed in ourselves or in others. But the optimistic story is that there is an antidote to stress, and trust is the antidote to stress. It leads us back to when we started this conversation. I asked you to think about relationships or experiences that really grounded you in the purpose. And I imagine even just thinking of some of those experiences or those relationships, and some of us might have triggered another different stress or chemical response in our bodies. How many of you guys, although I can't see you, but think in your head, have heard of oxytocin, the love hormone? Probably many of you are also familiar with this. And the love hormone is released by positive relationships. And the good news is oxytocin is even more powerful than cortisol, and it produces resilience to future stress. So whether or not we have experienced already ACEs, chronic stress, toxic stress, having the presence of a buffering relationship can mitigate the impact of the stress that it's already had, and it can also prepare us for future challenges that come up in our life. And so when we talk about relationships with children, it really is about more than being nice to a child. It's about creating the types of supports that can fundamentally change the way a child develops and the way their brain functions structurally and functionally. So one of the ways that we can think about doing this, if you think about that vision for school and student success that I shared with you in the very beginning, is through creating safe, calm, and predictable learning environments that create the conditions for healthy development. And so we need environments to be safe, calm, and predictable in order to bring the noise down, create consistency, norms, patterns in our classrooms and our schools so that children can be prepared and are less likely to be triggered by something in their environment. And so this slide shows just how environments can be dysregulating or co-regulating. And the foundation of co-regulation is actually having these positive relationships. So we talked about how the positive relationship is important on an interpersonal level because of the hormonal response that your body has in response to those relationships. But it can also, when you have that type of relationship, you're able to then lock in and co-regulate with another adult, with a child. I'm sure all of us can think about after that stressful, the amygdala trigger that you thought about, where did you go for support? For some of us, maybe you called a spouse, you called your mom, you called a best friend. You went somewhere where you were going to get some co-regulatory capacity. And environments can create that too. So a co-regulating environment feels physically and emotionally safe, it's predictable, it's marked by positive relationships, students have a strong sense of belonging, and there's scaffolds for stress management and self-regulation. And all of these things, when you think about your position as a district leader or a school leader or someone working with other educators, these things are mirrored in the types of environments we need to create to have healthy adult development and create the kind of support for adults to be able to engage in this very challenging work. And I want to spend just a moment digging into how we create the context. Again, the environments and the relationships to reveal and build the skills and mindsets children need to be learners. So I want to start by doing a little bit of a research dive into actually an old debunked study. So some of you have probably heard of the Marshmallow test. It was a series of experiments done at Stanford University in the 60s and 70s. And they were looking at the ability to delay gratification, which is a big part of executive functioning and self-regulation. So again, think about your prefrontal cortex. Think about the conditions that need to be in place in order for you to have access to the learning parts of your brain. And the way this test played out was they sat a bunch of preschoolers in a room and said, you can have one marshmallow now, or you can wait 15 minutes, and when I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows. So here's a real quick video of what that test looked like. Preschoolers aren't necessarily known for their ability to self-regulate and delay gratification. So it's always cute to see them, all the different strategies they try to deploy and ways that they try to really hang in there and wait for that second marshmallow. So what they did after they ran this experiment with a number of nursery school children was that they did a bunch of follow-up studies. And what they found was that the children that in that original test had been able to delay gratification, wait for that second marshmallow, it was correlated with all sorts of outcomes that were seemingly intractable. Everything from higher SAT scores to better jobs to lower teen pregnancy rates, lower substance abuse, better cognitive and social skills, all of these things that were really correlated with the things we care about, a lot of these successful life outcomes. And so the conclusion they drew was that this was a fixed trait. These nursery school children either had or did not have this very important factor, and that sort of put them on the path one way or the other. And so what we now know, and I want to tell you about the follow-up study to this test that was conducted by Dr. Celeste Kidd, who at the time was at Rochester University. She had worked at a homeless shelter and thought to herself, would any of my kids, any of the students, the young people that I worked with at this homeless shelter, would any of them have waited for that second marshmallow? More importantly, would it even make sense for them to wait for that second marshmallow? Would it be rational? So she redid the experiment and she changed one thing. When the children came into the room prior to the study, she had a set of broken crayons on the desk. And she said, while you wait for us to start the test, let me go and I'll get you a new set of art supplies that you can use. And for half the children, she came back with that brand new set of art supplies, those beautiful crayons. And for the other half, she came back and she said, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to do that. We don't have any more. And so for half, she fulfilled the promise, and for half, she had not. And so for half, she had created a reliable environment and built trust. And for half of the students, she had not. And then she redid the experiment. And what do you think happened? Okay, for the students that she had created a reliable environment for, marked by trust, those students waited 4 times as long as the students that did not receive the new art supplies. And more importantly, it actually erased all of the differences across race, socioeconomic lines, and it demonstrated the utter importance and influence context can have on whether or not we are in environments that reveal the skills that are already in our children. So the takeaway of this is not that every child in your classroom or school will be an Einstein or will be a Martin Luther King or a Malala, but the way our schools and our learning environments are currently designed, they're designed in such a way that we might never know if one of those remarkable individuals was in our classrooms. So understanding the importance of context is an equity issue. And if we're to fulfill our mission of creating a more equitable education system, we're thinking about transforming the system in a way that meets the needs of each and every child, we need to take the concept of context, building trust, reliability very seriously. So context matters. There is actually no development outside of context. And this context indeed puts children on their own unique developmental pathways. And no two are alike. They're a result of complex interactions between innate biology and the environment, relationships, and experiences that students have. But when we look across all individual children and think, what is similar and what patterns do we see? When we did that at Turnaround, what fell out of the research when we asked those questions was a framework about how children become learners and the essential skills and mindsets that are critical to them doing so. So on the screen, you see our building blocks for a learning framework, and our current system assumes that children are coming into school already with these bottom 2 rows in place. And those bottom two rows of skills, attachment, self-regulation, executive functions, self-awareness, all of these very important foundational skills, those are also the exact same skills that are most impacted by trauma and adversity in early life. So we know, because development is jagged, every child is on their own unique pathway, and context matters, that we have to deliberately pay attention to and build these skills explicitly, as well as create the types of learning environments that will reveal and reinforce these skills. So it's important also to know that every one of these building blocks that became part of our framework for learning is malleable and is aligned with the child as a learner. So it's important that none of these things, you'll notice there aren't any things that are fixed traits on this type of framework. Everything on here is something that can be explicitly built and developed across the lifetime. So schools can create the context to unlock the potential in every child. And they have the power to unlock that potential through intentionally developing the skills and mindsets every learner needs to succeed, which brings us back to the power that you carry. So each of us has come to this line of work, and then more granularly, this webinar, for a specific reason, and are in a position where we can have a tremendous impact on the development of each and every child within either our schools or our systems, or if we work with schools from outside of the system. It's important for us to recognize that from wherever we are, whether it's thinking from a policy level about how we prepare teachers with this level of knowledge and ingrain it into teacher prep programs, or how we organize districts around some of the relationship building strategies that we know are essential, or how we design policies for discipline that create the kind of context that we know matter for children to become learners. Each of us has a role to play. So I want to spend the last couple of minutes that we have together thinking about this question. So from your seat, how can you use the science to design learning environments that reveal the potential of all students and adults to thrive? Because what we know is that skill development does not happen in children if we have not first paid attention to the adults in the system that are reinforcing these skills in children. So take a minute, and this is our last mentee poll. But think about how can you use the science of learning to design environments that reveal the potential of all children and adults to thrive? And then we'll have a little bit of time for any questions or conversations that this sparked for you. This is great. As we're waiting for the last few responses to come in, does anybody have a question or want to add maybe what didn't fit in your Mentimeter box around how you're thinking about applications for this, or if you have questions about what it might look like to put some of this into practice? I would love to hear a little bit more about how you guys are all thinking about this.
Hey, Amy, this is Barbara. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm in an Uber to the airport. That's why I lost all visual. But one of the really interesting Segundo's using Mark Brackett's ruler points that you also brought up was that in order for this to truly work, the adults need to participate as well. And I'm wondering, and I was talking with Karen about this, and she was also, it totally makes sense, but it sort of struck us both like, wow, that's really interesting. I don't know if, Amy, if you can, you're on the calls or someone else, how hard is it to get teacher not only buy-in to do this type of work with students, but to do it for themselves first? What are maybe the better way to pose the question is, what is one obstacle and how did you overcome it? I'm going to go on mute now so you don't hear the traffic.
I would defer to Alice or Martha Monahan if they're on the call. I thought I saw both of them earlier.
I can also talk from our experience at Turnaround. What we really focus on building the capacity of adults. So all of our work is with adult educators and adults in the system. And I think one barrier, I'm thinking about a training I led with a group of educators where someone came up to me afterwards and said, listen, I have had 8 of these 10 ACEs in my own personal life. Am I okay to be doing this work with students? And what it did for me, it was a major paradigm shift of like, yes, and none of this is fate. Like, because of the malleability of the brain, because of the power of relationships, that despite of the experiences that you've had in the right context and with supportive relationships, and being intentional about building those buffers, really everyone can thrive. And it becomes sort of your superpower, is having the empathy and the experience and the success to have overcome and have built all of that resilience is a pretty remarkable superpower that so many of our educators have. But it really is, like any of this work, any equity work, any of this really hard work, it starts with a lot of self-reflection on what your own experiences and environments have led you to believe, to do, and then starting to, if it is actively dismantling problematic mindsets, or it is just even carving out little tiny bits of space where you are doing your own breathing or connecting with someone important to you to help provide those buffers. They're all just small changes that you can make to pay attention to the adults in the system that are actively working with students every single day.
Thanks, Amy.
Does anyone else have anything to add or ideas how they've seen educators shift their mindset around this, or be able to take this work on, or any examples of doing this in your schools where you've been able to build the conditions where adults are building trust with each other or with leadership? well, I think we're at time anyway, so keep thinking about that. But is there, should I pass it back to either Barbara or Jessica or Trisha to wrap us up?
Yeah, Trisha, do you want to wrap this up? Or I'm sorry, Jessica, that might have been you. My apologies. I'm, as I said, I don't have visual.
That's okay, Barbara. I was just going to say thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate your time, your energy, your passion for what you're doing. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for the call. And feel free to follow up and definitely check out Turnaround and all of the work they're doing. Thank you for that slide, Amy. And thank you. It was really so fascinating in so many different respects. We'll see you next month.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, guys.
Thanks, Amy. Bye.
Of course, thank you.
Bye.